Greetings, it is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! It is time to continue my discussion on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the second edition of AD&D. We last left off, we've been talking about traveling in our ancient Dungeons & Dragons world, and today I'm going to talk about ocean voyaging. Alright, so the travel amongst the ocean can be an incredibly dangerous thing. Gigantic sea serpents, maelstroms, all kinds of things, perhaps even primitive navigational tools. All these things can make it difficult to travel, but they aren't the only things. These are the big things your captains probably won't ever really deal with. They don't want to deal with them. Just things like simple storms, pirates, hidden shoals, and, well, the ship quality that they have, that's what they have to deal with. All the imaginary stuff that might be out there that they might face, those are dangers they may never run into. They may never have to deal with. So there will be dangers that your ocean-dwelling captains will have to deal with that are much more realistic. The AD&D world is one of medieval world. So you have to think about medieval world and the technology they have. Most of the ships they have are not built for deep ocean voyage. There are very few decent sailing ships that could even think about moving into deep ocean sailing. And even then, they are not properly built, not for the best and longest of voyages. So the majority of ships will stay close to shore or relatively shallow areas, places especially where they can keep eye on shore. The techniques for navigation aren't as good as they would be in, let's say, more Renaissance era. So most of the time in your D&D worlds, you're not going to have that perfect navigation. So they want to have that sight of land. Also, for our sailing ships, which might be able to go into some deeper ocean, you have to worry about some other things. They're still not the best seaworthiness, so a good storm might still scuttle them. They don't have things like, well, adequate space for very long voyages, so you want a lot of supplies for these deep ocean voyages. Depending on how long it is, you might not have enough space. These are not large ships yet. We haven't built the biggest of all sailing ships. So even those sailing ships are still relatively small in comparison to others. So you can see there are limitations both on our possible deep sea side and just our normal ships, which don't have a lot of these advantages anyway. So of course they're going to stay close to where if something goes wrong, they can always swim to shore. Ship sailing is very rudimentary. Now, this doesn't mean there aren't other ways around long-term travel, because guess what? If you're rich and powerful, there's ways of doing it. Going aerial, flying there somehow, going undersea, basically using connections with various undersea creatures to transport things. There are things like aquatic elves and tritons you might be able to make deal with, maybe even merfolk, or magical transportation. These are all ways of getting you from one place to another that does not involve long-term sailing. Now, some of these are more practical than other when it comes to cargo, which is an important way to look at this. Aerial travel for cargo? Well, I mean, if you have a literally large creature that can carry a lot, maybe a little bit. Undersea connections? Well, if you don't mind it getting wet, whatever you're transporting, then yeah, that probably could work. Teleportation? Nah, for cargo, that's too expensive. It doesn't carry enough on its own, usually when you're transporting cargo with some kind of teleportation. So making that a way that you're shipping things is not a practical investment, especially when we're talking about cargo, which is made for making profit. What are you going to have to do? Charge them an exorbitant extra amount? No one will want to buy. Now, this isn't to say that we don't have plenty of ships to take away from and try to use. There is a chart in the AD&D book of various ships and their base speeds, their emergency speeds, and their seaworthiness percentage, basically how good they are at traveling across open ocean. The base movement is how they are traveling under good conditions. There's two numbers there for some fishes. First number is sails, second number is oars if they go by rowing too. Now, emergency speed is basically the speed that either maximizing the sails or pushing your rowers can achieve, usually during emergencies and combat situations. This is a speed that cannot be maintained for a long period of time, as pushing the sails too much will cause them to break, ropes to tear, rigging to break apart, things like that. Rowers will cause them to get exhausted and be unable to work anymore. So there's a lot of disadvantages to pushing to emergency speed, but in case of emergency, you might need it. And the last thing is the seaworthiness percentage. is if something occurs, whether storm, monster attack, ramming, any of these kind of things that could cause a problem and possibly cause your ship to sink, your dungeon master could call for a seaworthiness test. This is a percentage test that they roll percentile dice, and as long as you meet or get under that number, your ship doesn't sink. If you exceed that number, your ship sinks to this, because it's only that seaworthy. It's only made to exist in the sea by that amount of percentage, and problems could occur that could just cause it to swamp. Now granted, even if you make the percentage, depending on the circumstances, there might still be repairs needed or even bailing that needs to be done in order to keep the ship afloat. It's just going to be a base level of what your DM could use to measure whether or not you're sinking or not. It is also important to note that if you're at port or anchor, increase the seaworthiness by 50%. It's really hard for a lot of these basic ways of scuttling a ship to occur during that time. Granted, there are situations in which it's probably pretty impossible for ships not to sink, but those are usually your giant maelstroms, your massive sea serpents, things like that are those mythical things that even if you happen anchored or at port, you can't really do much about them. Now, many ships, especially during this general period of time that we're recreating, were at the whims of the weather, especially wind, and especially the waves. So you can see that weather was an important factor on how well your ship will travel. When you are determining weather, you will both determine the wind and the generalized precipitation. And using these two information will determine how your ship is affected by it, because each of these will affect your ship individually, though they will compound together. You will look to the wind and see if it's going to be more of a favorable wind, unfavorable wind. Unfavorable winds, you might have to worry about them blowing you off course depending on how much of a storm it is. The rest of the weather with the rain and precipitation just could cause you to travel slower. Weather will be determined by the season, and it should be checked about once a day, because weather should be about consistent for most of the day. When you roll a certain weather, that's what it should be for the entire day. That helps keep consistency and estimate travel times correctly. Now today I did want to talk a little bit about aerial movement. We've talked about a little bit of aerial combat in the past, but aerial movement is something that could happen too, just moving around. And most of the rules on aerial movement handled in the past, you have to consider the sky, the clear sky, your terrain, the area you're going and traveling in. What we want to talk about right now is weather when it comes to aerial combat, because weather is actually the terrain modifications to your sky that you are dealing with as you're flying. Now, much like what we were talking about on the seaside with weather, you will be determining both precipitation and wind separately. If you are rolling randomly, just like you were for the ship, because again, for any of these, you can choose what you want also as the DM, depending on what you want to do to your players. But if you roll randomly, do wind first, that's the first one you consider, and then look to precipitation. Precipitation, the type of it, will also depend on the season, of course, and it will depend on the terrain you're in. Certain terrains will determine precipitation more or less than others. Things like winter and summer, you'll roll a d6 on a 6 is precipitation. Spring and fall, a 5 or a 6 is precipitation. But if I'm in some place like a desert, probably not going to have precipitation. That'll be very rare. So you should, if you roll it once on travel throughout for a desert, you're probably not going to have it come up again. Important notes on that. You do want to look to the terrain below the flyer, just to make sure you know what kind of weather would be appropriate. And season and terrain and all that kind of stuff mixed together for everything else. Just because it's winter doesn't mean you're going to get snow. Depends on where you're at. If I'm in a tropical jungle, which now doesn't really have a very bad winter, it's usually just, we're warm now instead of hot. Well, then we're still going to rain. Granted, this is a very simple way of determining weather, but it helps. And once again, aerial movement will be affected similar to ship movement when it comes to weather, to affect how fast you're traveling, how much distance you're covering while encountering this weather. But that's it for today. So I handled two other major types of movement that you're going to be doing. Ocean traveling, which we have to remember. Dungeons & Dragons is based on a medieval world. So we're talking under medieval ships. This is different than our Renaissance sailing ships, Age of Enlightenment with our big explorers traveling the world. That's an entirely different type of ship. Now, granted, The actual level of ship technology you want to bring in is completely up to you, and you could put it as that. But you should harken back to the original essence of what Dungeons & Dragons is. Medieval, Dark Ages kind of world based upon fantasy. And think about ship travel with that. Then, of course, I did move on and talk just a little bit about your aerial travels, traveling from one place to another throughout the sky. In the next episode, we're going to start out with getting lost, because that's something that can occur to you whether you're traveling on foot, on a boat, or even in the sky sometimes. You can get lost. You can not know where you are, and you might have to find a way back home. But I hope you're having a great day. If you have any interesting stories from a role-playing game where you were traveling on some kind of ship, or flying and had some kind of adventure there, why don't you leave those stories for me in the description below? I always like to hear the stories of your various games. Regardless, though, until the next time, I bid you farewell.